Okay, guys, I'm here today with John Danaher. Huge honor for me, Nikki. And guys, today we just shot the entire instructional, not today, right, John? These last 4 days, right? Yeah, we just shot the entire instructional of John, the 5th part of the New Wave series, which is all about bottom half guard, which is one of my favorite techniques, by the way, John. And but I love watching you doing the half guard no gi, because I think all my career I did half guard with the gi pretty much. And this was always something that I was always missing on my game. Like, how can I use my half guard on no-gi? And I love the stuff you taught. And,
yes. One of the big themes of their New Wave guard series in general, both open guard and also now in half guard, is the broad differences between gi and no-gi performance. And as you pointed out, it's so easy to have a game which is very, very well refined for gi or no gi, but difficult to cross them over with each other. So a big part of what we do is we look at what are the main differences between gi and no gi. And most of them are based around the idea of grip. And so we bring some interesting elements that I'll talk about later on in this video about how we adjust our behavior from bottom half guard. But let's start off looking at a notion, Bernardo, which you're very familiar with because you were equally strong in top and bottom in half guard. You were a very good half guard passer and a very good half guard player. And that's the idea of the essential contradiction in half guard. You will often hear me talking to my students and saying, when they're in top position, get into his half guard, get into his half guard. The idea being that half guard is one of the very best positions in the sport to pass a tough opponent's guard. For example, Bernardo, you had some of your greatest successes against guard specialists by forcing your way into half guard top, getting your passes, and then from there putting tremendous pressure on them. You were very good at over-under passing, and you would often use your over-under pass to force half guard and then complete from half guard. We do the same thing in no-gi. So you'll often hear me coaching my students when they're the passing athlete, force your way into their half guard, pass from there. The idea is it's an advantage to pass from half guard. And yet, you'll hear me coaching the very same athletes, if they find themselves in bottom position, work your way into half guard, as though half guard bottom is the advantage. And you've got to ask yourself, what's going on here? Why is it that you tell your students when they're on top to get into half guard, it's an advantage, and at the same time, when they're on bottom, force your way into half guard, it's an advantage. Like, how does this work? It seems like a contradiction. How can it be the best position for both the top and the bottom guy at the same time? Well, it all comes down to managing the relationship between my outside shoulder and his outside shoulder, my outside hip and his outside hip. Let's have a look at this. If I have nickel cheese on top of me in half guard, from here, we're pretty much entirely neutral. But if nickel cheese goes through and dominates my outside shoulder and brings it down towards the mat and cements it in place, he might do it with a top head and arm grip like so, cross face and underhook. He might do it with double underhooks. He might do it with near side underhook here, taking his arm out and putting his head down on the floor like so. He might do it by going near side underhook here and bringing head down on this side to the floor like so. However he does it, he pins my outside shoulder down to the mat. If he can do that, he's got a tremendous advantage. If I, on the other hand, can take my outside shoulder and bring it up and off the mat, like so, and he comes in towards me, it's going to be very, very hard for him now to put any kind of positional control over me. And relatively easy for me to create space, which can translate into leg lock attacks on either leg, or some kind of tight waist grip, which enables me to go into various forms of sweep and also into other kinds of leg locks that you were actually very interested in throughout your career, Bernardo, the Hisagatame or dog bar, as it's sometimes known. So these forms of grip and connection entail me getting my shoulder off the mat. If I, as it were, win this battle for underhook position, my opponent can go to the next level and start winning here at the hip. And he can walk, usually with a near side underhook, across my hips and force my outside hip down to the mat. And this too can create tremendous problems for me. Ultimately, what I want to do is I want to make sure that my outside hip and my outside shoulder are off the mat. That's how half guard can be either a great position for him or a great position for me. They can't both be great at the same time. That would be an obvious contradiction. But half guard as a general position can be very good for him or for me, depending on the position of my outside shoulder and my outside hip. The general rule is that I, as the bottom athlete, always want my outside shoulder and my outside hip off the ground. I want to be on my inside hip and my inside shoulder. There are some important exceptions to this, and we'll look at these. There are deep half guard variations where we really do go so far in the opposite direction, you get a new kind of advantage. We'll definitely be covering that in the video series. But what I don't want is both of my hips on the floor, both of my shoulders on the floor. That will stop me in my tracks. It's okay under these circumstances to go deep half guard and come out the other side, where now I have the outside shoulder and the outside hip on the mat, but my inside shoulder and my inside hip are off the mat. Okay, so even this is okay. In fact, in some ways, it's actually damn good. But what I can't do is have both of my hips and both of my shoulders pinned down to the mat. Now it's an absolute advantage for the top guy. Okay, so a big part of what we're looking to do in this video is to create conditions where I prevent my outside hip, outside shoulder being put down to the mat, like so. And from here, we can turn up into our opponent and go into the legs. If I feel myself getting flattened out, the onus is on me to find ways to recover from situations where both of my shoulders are pinned down to the mat. In these situations, we often use off-balancing techniques, such as a knee lever, where we pinch around our training partner and force the training partner to base out with hands. And once they start basing out with hands, it becomes easy for us to go back underneath our training partner and into positions where we can get up and on the attack. Okay? So there's the fundamental contradiction of half guard, the idea that it can be both a great position for the person attacking from on top, if they can pin both shoulders and both hips to the mat. It can be a great position for the person on bottom if they can keep the outside shoulder and the outside hip off the mat, and in some extreme cases go all the way to getting the inside hip and shoulder off the mat in deep half guard. We'll be looking a lot at this theme throughout the video. Now, Bernardo, there's also some very important sub-themes that we look at throughout this video. One of them is something that we touched on a lot, and it represents one of the main themes of new wave guard play. This is the idea of mixed strategy between jiu-jitsu and wrestling for no-gi sweeps. The idea is that the grips that we employ, no-gi, are typically much less robust than the grips that we can use with a gi. The grips tend to be transitory and easily broken by a knowledgeable resisting opponent. And so we tend to get grips for much shorter periods of time. We get to these transient grips, we off-balance an opponent with some form of jiu-jitsu sweep and break their stance and posture, and then come up into our opponents and complete with some form of wrestling takedown, usually double legs or body locks, getting around our opponent's waist, hips, and using really strong locked hands to complete a takedown. Let's look at some common sense examples here. We just looked at a knee level. Why not use that now to demonstrate the principle? Okay, we start off in what seems like a pretty unpromising situation. You've got an opponent who's right there on top of you. He's done a good job of pinning both my hips and both my shoulders to the mat. So from here, we've got to start getting out of this position. First thing we've got to do is get up into a situation where I can off-balance my opponent, okay? Look how from here, I can get my opponent out of balance, and as a result, I can start going through underneath my training partner's arms into a position where we're much more able now to turn up onto our side and get our outside shoulder and hip up off the mat. As a result, we're able to go through on a training partner and start coming up, building up to our elbow underneath the mat. I take my outside leg and hook onto my training partner's leg like so. From these kinds of situations, we're going to hit a classic jiu-jitsu sweep that many of you will recognize, where I scoop in underneath my training partner, and from situations like this, I come whipping back in the direction that we've just come from and force my training partner to base out on the floor, like so. From situations like this, you've created a huge instability in this direction. Okay, what do you think your opponent's going to want to do? He's going to come back into you and flatten you out and put you back into the flattened position that you just came from. Okay, so when I get my opponent moving out to my left, when I see him pushing back in, we come right back up And now we're into a single leg situation. From single leg situation, your opponent, if he stays in a position like this, is relatively easy to take down. We're always looking from situations like this to get our shoulder in behind our training partner and start a mild sit out that exposes our training partner's heel, just like so. From here, we bring the foot up and shelf it. From here, we go through to our training partner's ankle, we start driving into our training partner. Sometimes we'll go across to our training partner's far knee. When he tries to get up and away from us, it's just to drive forward into our man and put him down to a hip. Now we go through and lock at our training partner's waist. When he goes in to try and get away from us in situations like this, it's awfully difficult and pretty easy for us to complete the takedown and score our points. So you see what's happening here. We're using a fairly classical sweep from Jiu-Jitsu to create a strong off-balancing effect that compromises our opponent's base. Then it's up to us to come up and get to our opponent's waist and lock our hands and secure a takedown, which looks more like the sport of wrestling than it does the sport of Jiu-Jitsu.
But came from the heifer.
Yes, but it started with a form of connection often seen in Jiu-Jitsu. Then we can do the same thing to set up leg lock attacks. I'll demonstrate it again out of knee
I was waiting for you to talk about leg lock.
So, again, we start off with an opponent here in front of us who's gotten into a position where I think most people would agree this doesn't look very promising for leg locks. Okay, normally we associate half guard leg locks with space in front of us, and that's where most of our attention in the video comes from, working out of knee shield with this space between his chest and mine. But people often ask me, what if I screw up and this guy gets right on top of me here? Okay, well, a knee lever is a great way to generate space. Very often when we hit a knee lever, we will trap our opponent's elbow. Now the only thing he can base out with is this leg. I have his right leg trapped. This arm is preoccupied with the cross face. This arm is trapped by my arm. So that's the only base he's got. So when I tilt my training partner over, that's the only action he can do to hold his base. As he does so, I post right there in my training partner's armpit. As he goes to recover his position, I bring my knee back up to my chest. And I have my two hands right there in front of my training partner's armpit. I swim into a kind of a quasi-butterfly guard, and I start getting my opponent going over my right shoulder, a simple elevation that came out of that initial knee level. From this position, we start getting our man moving out to the side. As his knees go apart, my hand switches through underneath, and it's going to be very easy for us now to go through on our training partner and get my knee right in behind his knee. That's the whole key. My knee behind his. So when he goes to flee the mat, move away, etc., you have a very tight connection to his legs. At this point, I have a choice. Will I go with a classic Senkaku type hold? That's good if I want to turn my opponent over. Okay. If I want to finish front side, this is an excellent hold. I take my shoelaces and I put them in front of his stomach, and it's an easy thing now to turn him over into a very tight finish. If I want to finish backside, this is not the optimal hold, because in order to finish backside, I have to be able to push into the back of my opponent's leg, preferably close to the back of his knee. Inside Senkaku doesn't do a good job of that. When he pushes back in, you see I can't push effectively into the back of his knee. So instead, when I see him pushing back in, we thread our foot through and around, and we go into a crisscross ashi. This enables me to push very strongly into the back of his knee. When Nick Ortiz tries to push back into me, that's a losing gambit, and we get very strong braking pressure as a result. So once again, we have a tough opponent who's done a good job of flattening us out. We know that half guard is a wonderful attacking guard unless we get both of our shoulders and hips pinned down to the mat. Then it's not much good to us at all. It's good for him. From this position, we start off, thumb post in place. I start off by hitting a simple knee lever that creates sufficient space that I can get my hands inside. You'll see that I double thumb post inside my training partner's armpit. My knee comes up to my chest, so as he goes to recover position, we're in a good place now to get our butterfly guard in. Now I start the action of lifting up and over my shoulder, taking my body through, rotating, and focusing on getting my knee around behind my training partner's knee. That's the connection I'm always looking for. Okay, it's that, which means when he goes to flee the mat, I have sufficient connection to make sure we're in charge. From the back side position, you got an excellent bite on your training partner's heel. I make my decision. will I turn him over and convert it backside to front side? Or if he goes to push back into me, I'll thread my foot through into crisscross ashi. Now you have an ability to push on the back of his leg. When he tries to come back into us, it's not going to happen. And we'll get a very strong finish indeed. So you can see from there that regardless of your starting position, there's always a way to navigate back into the sound fundamental principles. You want to stay away from situations where two shoulders are locked on the mat, where two hips are locked on the mat. You always want to create situations where, in most cases, the outside shoulder and hip are off the mat, but in a few cases, which you were very familiar with,
yep.
the inside shoulder and inside hip come off the mat, and you go to deep half guard. Regardless of your starting point, there's always a way to navigate yourself into a situation where you can create space and stay in tune with those laws of the shoulders and hips. And if you can stay true to those principles of shoulders and hips, you can come up and attack your opponent, regardless of whether you want to go lower body for submissions. In general, I'm sure you realize from watching my students in operation, when they work from half guard, it's almost always initiated by leg attacks. No surprises there. You'll see how they do it in the video. And of maintaining very, very close connection to an opponent. Bernardo, this is something I wanted to talk about, and I have talked about a lot in the video. The idea that when you look at most forms of guard play, there's a sense in which they are all voluntary. Okay, if Nick Ortiz and I are standing, and I'm seated in front of him, and I'm playing a fairly standard squad tactic where I work from seated guard, the only thing that forces Nick Ortiz to engage with me is him. Okay, if Nick Ortiz didn't want to play jiu-jitsu with me, he'd just walk away from him. There's nothing holding him. Only his desire to pass my guard brings him forward. Now contrast that with half guard. If I get a good outside hook on my training partner and a good tight waist and my ear to his chest, it's so engaging. Okay. If my opponent wants to stand up and get away from me from here, good luck. He's going to have to do some work. Okay, and the more he goes to disengage with me, the easier it becomes for me now, as he goes up and away, for me to come up into my training partner and start walking into this man and focusing on bringing him down. There's so much connection from half guard that it's probably one of the very few, if not the only guard position where you can say that the bottom man can impose the engagement from bottom position.
That makes sense.
There's no other guard. Maybe you could say close guard, but even then, it's only really the lock of the feet, which is easily broken by someone who knows what they're doing. Half guard is one of the few, maybe possibly the only case, where from bottom position, a good jiu-jitsu player can force the other guy to engage on the ground. Because there's so much close body contact through the tight waist, the hook of the legs, and the more they pull away, they actually pull you up into takedowns. And so it represents one of the very best means by which someone can truly force engagement from bottom position and grappling.
Yeah, no, I agree. Oh, John, and I think one of the reasons that people love your videos so much is that we can see on your students, we can see them do exactly what you teach. So I don't know how many matches I have watched from Craig Jones that he goes to the knee shields and then everything starts from there and then he goes to the leg attacks, everything from the half guard. Gordon, the same thing. And the other day Gary was here and we were playing around here with techniques. It was pretty much exactly what you just showed. So you can see that I think many jiu-jitsu instructors, these students don't replicate what they teach. They're more like leaders than instructors. And on your case, it's like...
What I typically observe is that in any training room, you typically have some outstanding individuals whose game looks nothing like their instructors and doesn't look anything like the other people in the room.
But the instructor is such a great leader that he...
So he creates a good environment for them to train, but you wouldn't look at the student and say, like, he was obviously trained by that guy. Or you couldn't look at the student and say, wow, he looks pretty much the same as that guy over there and that guy over there. They're kind of doing the same thing. I think what people found interesting about the squad is that even though they have their own individual differences,
it's the same foundation.
Yeah, the foundation looks very similar, and you can. It even gets to a point where, at the ADCC trials, you can look at someone who is clearly copying the tactics of a Craig Jones or a Gordon Ryan or a Gary Tonin. There's a kind of distinctive look and feel to it, and I think people found that interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree. And John, the other thing here that caught my attention a lot is like one of the biggest strugglings I had on half guard no gi is because with gi, I used to let people get the underhook and hold my head, and I would work to go underneath them and catch the lapel and that. And then no gi took me a long time to understand that you can never give away the underhook. And when I see your students, when they get the half guard on top, that's the very first thing they try to do, right? Is to get the underhook.
They're always trying to pin the shoulders to the mat. Most of the time they go far side or outside shoulder. But if they can't get that, they'll go near side shoulder and use their head to
no, but I love it like how clear was the concept that you can never let your hip and your shoulders, unless you're in the deep half guard, right? That's probably the only exception.
We actually look in this video at deep half guard as one of the best means of entering into leg locks.
Got it.
Because by turning so far out and creating such an exaggerated movement away from your opponent, you often get an ability to spin around your opponent's legs in some very
I can see
interesting ways to set up interesting leg lock attacks. But you're absolutely right though, Bernardo. My students would rather die than just give up.
I agree.
And under the far side, they fight for that every step of the way.
No, John, for me, that I'm a half guard player, this is the video that I'm probably gonna watch the most, and I'm just like mad here. I wish this was done like 10 years ago and I was competing, you know, like, and no, that's awesome. So guys, this entire instructional video with John, all about half guard no gi. That's the 5th part of the New Wave series. It's gonna be at IBJJFanatics.com very soon. Maybe by the time you're watching, it's already there. So make sure to check that out. And thanks so much, John.
Thanks so much, Bernardo.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Nick.
Please help me out to grow my YouTube channel. Just click subscribe. And to watch more videos, just click under see more videos. I hope you enjoyed.
IBJJFanatics.com. Use the promo code YouTubeFaria to get 10% off any instructional video. Improve your jiu-jitsu faster.